are salt on this earth, bringing flavor to the selfish routines of the world. You are light, bringing clarity and vision to places of darkness and confusion. Do not give in to anger. Instead, reconcile with others and settle divisions. Let your words be simple, direct, and clean, not cluttered by empty promises. Take no revenge for violence. Instead, show the power of your will to endure, even in suffering. Take courage and stand for the transformation of your enemy. In love, stand tall against the prevailing cynicism of the world. Let your response to aggression be not fearful, but a redemptive, creative, and life-giving force. In this way, you shall be strong, in fact, perfect, reflecting your Maker, an overflowing fountain of forgiveness to cool and ease and heal this troubled world.
Musical drama, a little redemption story about my namesake, St. Paul. It's called The Transformation of a Terrorist, Holy War. It's a reminder that God doesn't give up on any of us, no matter how violent or self-righteous we are. Holy war upon a rabbi in Jerusalem. I was the one to shake the bloodstained hands. Anger mounts as we condemn devotee of the Son of Man. Temple mob murder Stephen in a hail of stones. We put him down to bury bones with the prophets. Oh, with the prophets we adore. Oh, religion makes this chore. Self-righteous judgment fills my veins as Stephen plummets down in pain. So free of hatred as he sang to lift his hands and praise your name. My mind is boiling up with fear of others who may join him near. It would happen, they would claim their broken master did appear. But on a mission I will go to martyr them of those I know, try to follow in his way, a shameful blot upon the day. Hey, oh, kill! Annihilate all I see of this disgrace. Protect my faith upon this chase, this affront upon my race. The way to Damascus I do ride, my heart swallowed up with pride, my ego blown so far and wide, a heart of hatred filled with lies. But you knocked me clear off my high horse, show me the folly of my course. Why you oppress and kill and hate? You better change for it's too late. For I have called you to be free, but now you're blind and you can't see. Humble yourself before your enemies, and you may find them friends to be. Lighten things up a little bit now. This is a reggae praise song that I wrote called Father Creation. And it addresses our connection to Mother Earth and the biosphere and all of creation and our connection to that. And this is one you can all sing along to, so get ready. Oh, we can start the groove. That'll bring her on. you. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. That's it. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. Here we go. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. 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 Now we really need you right here. Here we go. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. One more. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Ta-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Tonight we are in for a treat. Our speakers are a hip-hop artist and a scholar of intercultural theology. So we'll put that together and it's going to be interesting. They're going to speak on let the sacred be defined by the people and aesthetics of liberation across religious lines. This is Dr. Michelle Voss-Roberts and Demi Day McCoy. Michelle is a newly minted principal and professor of theology at Emmanuel College, University of Toronto. Her teaching and writing focuses on theology and interfaith engagement. Her contribution to the field of comparative theology include edited volume Comparing Faithfully, Insights for Systematic Theological Reflection, and Taste of the Divine, Hindu and Christian Theologies of Emotion, which received the Award for Excellence for the American Academy of Religion. Accompanying her is Demi Day McCoy, Assistant Director of Public Relations, Leadership, and Community Engagement at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. Demi Day is a spoken word artist and seeks to explore the art and science of biblical interpretation in new and fresh ways with the hope of enhancing other spiritual lives. Responding to their lecture tonight is Dr. Kirsten Kim, our new distinguished professor of world Christianity at Fuller, who joined in 2017, coming from her native UK. There, she served as a professor at Leeds Trinity University since 2011. Previously, she had been a theological educator in South Korea, where she taught English Bible and cross-cultural skills, and between 1993 and 97, she lectured in missiology at Union Biblical Seminary in Pune, India, as a missionary of the Presbyterian Church of Korea. She does theology in the context of world Christianity and for missional purposes, the editor of the Journal of Mission Studies and the book series Theology and Mission in World Christianity, both published by Brill. Her research interests and networks include theology of mission, pneumatology, world Christianity, Korean studies, and development studies. Her most recent of her 5 monographs are A History of Korean Christianity and Christianity as a World Religion, which she wrote in collaboration with her husband, Sebastian, who's also a professor at Fuller. It's going to be an exciting evening and look forward to hearing from you. Let's welcome them.
Check it. This is more than pro-black recognition of the facts. That prolific proposition that initiated rap. They don't seem to understand it ain't about us fighting back until we learn to be preemptive. All we can do is react. Stuck up in a cycle, victim homicidal, viral instances, Instagram images, then forget what the mission is. Witness to the premises of prison systems that damages villages permanently, terminally influence. The ending is congruent with the ignorance. Let's talk about it. We've been rerouted, tear gas to symbolize the way in which our sight is clouded, surrounded by misguided principles, nonsensical how government is non-reciprocal to justice. It just is a framework protecting non-adjustment, and we call that injustice. And God that we trusted, but with the state of our America, sometimes we get disgusted, because how can we side with the corrupted where rights have been abducted? We need revolutionary eruption, radical combustion. So let us become the interruption, start a new discussion. Good evening. It is my pleasure to be in this space with you and to be alongside Dr. Michelle Voss-Roberts to talk about our paper of how the sacred is being redefined by the people. And this paper arose out of an increasing need to join and support grassroots social justice movements, and in particular that of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also movements that sit adjacent to it. The rap that you just heard was, in fact, written in the wake of the death of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. So building on the work of Michelle's book, Taste of the Divine, which she'll tell you more about momentarily, we've used an Indian aesthetic theory to examine unique components of these grassroots social movements and how, as ministers and witnesses of the gospel, we can be attuned to it and be better listeners of the theological and Christological embodiment that is present. So after much examination, we thought it poignant to exemplify the elements of these movements by taking a deeper look at one of its principal forms, which is hip-hop, both in our backyard and across the globe. And as a hip-hop artist myself, I have a particular experience with the centrality of this art form in these movements. I'm also an ordained reverend in the Baptist tradition. So we're excited to share this with you, and I also want to add that this is beyond just hip hop as music. This is hip hop culture in all of its artistic forms, one of which is clothing, and so we've intentionally decided that I would embody that, and Michelle would embody the clothing that's sacred to her in this particular space, and that we can. And that we can join each other in this work together, both in our authentic truths.
My project has been to examine a Hindu and Christian theology of emotion by employing the classical aesthetic theory of India. This theory is a theory of Rasa, which has a number of meanings, the first of which is to describe the blissful, transcendent effect that art has. It's transcendent in that art can transport us out of ourselves beyond egocentricity so that we can savor an emotional mood. And so the Indian Hindu theologians have employed the concept of rasa to describe not only the original context, which is from Bharata's Natya Shastra, a manual on drama, but that same theory is used to talk about the religious experience, the experience of Brahman, the experience of devotional worship of God. And so rasa is that sort of effect of experiencing good art, but rasa is also a word that stands for each of the 9 basic moods that are savored in art. Nava rasa means these 9 rasas: love, humor, fury, compassion, disgust, heroism, fear, wonder, and peace. Each of these is rooted in a basic, common human emotion, but elevated through art so that people can savor it in that more generalized and non-egocentric way. The Natya Shastra lays out how rasa is produced, and it's in this Rasa Sutra, a short little pithy saying about how it's produced. It comes through the combination of excitants, or vibhavas, indicators, anubhavas, and transitory emotional states, vyabhichari bhavas. So when all of these things are together, a rasa will arise in an audience, and you'll hear more about what these are in a little bit. So my project was to examine 3 of these basic emotions as religious emotions, and to do it in a comparative way. So I examined peace, the peace of meditation, as a place where the 2 traditions can communicate. Love for divinity, devotional love, as another bridge. And then also fury at injustice. And so what I claim in this book is that rasa is a way of describing how interreligious understanding can take place. Now, I published this book in 2014. 2014 was also the year in which Officer Darren Wilson shot Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Michael Brown's body lay in the street for hours, inciting protests like maybe we've never seen before. And since then, this overlaps with the time that Demi and I spent together at Wake Forest in North Carolina. We saw movement after movement that embodied a similar sort of feeling. And reflecting on that, in light of this theory, we want to name another rasa. This is kind of a playful exercise of adding an additional rasa to the canon. And we're calling it the rasa of challenge. This is a cross-cultural phenomenon that stands up against injustice. It responds to injustice, but also builds solidarity across different contexts.
So while it's true that other genres of music and other forms of art participate in this rasa of challenge, we assert that hip-hop offers an especially salient example of a genre whose context and expressions are being mobilized to challenge injustice across cultures. And while many U.S. hip-hop records might carry themes of wealth and pleasure, there are a plethora of justice-oriented hip-hop artists that are creating art that really lies at the heart of movements like Black Lives Matter. So by attending to the rasa of challenge with hip-hop expressions as our focus, we want to be clear that we are not advocating that Christian missions adopt hip-hop as a medium or form for carrying the gospel message.
Rather, what we're advocating is that the learning for us as religious leaders is that we should become what the Indian aesthetic theory calls sahridayas. This is it's a kind of a connoisseur of art, but the word literally means one whose heart, hrid, resonates with sa, the mood of a performance. So even though rasa theory claims that all of the basic aesthetic emotions are rooted in common human emotions that we can all understand, to become really a connoisseur of art, a cultured viewer, it takes a little bit of training. So Bharatanatyam, for example, is a dance form inspired by and in the tradition of the Natya Shastra. And there's a lot that I can understand by watching a Bharatanatyam performance, but there's a lot that I don't understand. For example, the particularity of various mudras or hand gestures. I'm going to have to study a little bit. I'm going to have to learn more so that I can fully savor the mood of a performance. And similarly, for me, I need to be educated about what's happening in hip-hop so that I can understand it as well. And so the claim that we're making is that by attuning our hearts to the rasa of challenge, to attending to how the sacred is being redefined by the people, we might catch something of the heartbeat of Christ and participate in the movement of the Spirit in the world.
So since we're placing hip-hop at the center of this conversation for exemplifying the Rasa Challenge, I want to give you a brief overview of the history of hip-hop and where it's headed and where it is now. And so let's take a look at hip-hop. Hip-hop began in the early 1970s in Bronx, New York, alongside a post-industrial backdrop. And this was a time where pioneering DJs such as DJ Kool Herc, African Bambaataa, DJ Grandmaster Flash, started disc jockeying in a way where they would loop records, they would loop the break beats of records to make a seamless continuation of sound or of the get down portion of these records so that people who were gathered at parties could dance to these sounds. And those dancers we now know as break dancers because they were dancing on the break beat. You also might know them as B-boys or B-girls. And then out of this, we have the rise of the MC or the master of ceremonies. And this was a person who had a particular rhythmic way with words, a poetic way with words. And they would hype up the DJ and the dancers and the crowd. And now we know those artists today as rappers or rap artists. And then also during this time, graffiti became linked as one of the principal visual forms of the hip hop movement. So, although hip-hop gained its popularity initially through parties, it quickly became a vessel for social justice messages. And many early hip-hop artists used this form of expression to address social issues in their community. And one of the earliest and most notable examples of this type of subject matter is the record The Message, which you see the cover art here with DJ Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And the song features lyrics that speak about the reality and the impact of living in poverty, and most notably some of the lines, "Don't push me, 'cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head." It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under, right? And that jungle that they're speaking to is this jungle of Bronx, New York, right? In juxtaposition to a downtown New York that was flourishing. And so that's something you see as a visual cue in the video. They show these images side by side of how they're living and just down the street how wealth is flourishing. And so this not only shows up in this video, in this performance, but there are other performances in early hip hop by NWA and Dead Prez and Queen Latifah that go on to tackle issues of poverty and police brutality and sexism and so on and so forth. And so really once hip-hop started to be recorded and made its way across the nation, it really began to make its way across the globe. And so in recent decades, we've seen how hip-hop has tremendously spread across the globe, putting it in a unique position of intercultural and interreligious dialogue. The proliferation of hip-hop can be seen in a diverse array of hip-hop artists worldwide. And additionally, the universal popularity of hip-hop can be seen in the sold-out shows that are played by U.S. artists in countries abroad. In some countries where English is not the primary language, even though these artists are performing English raps. But again, there are artists who rap in all sorts of languages, and even tomorrow we're going to see this in another lecture. We're going to hear about an artist, Christian artist from Mozambique. And then another way we see this show up is in hip-hop festivals, one of which is the Trinity International Hip-Hop Festival, which takes place in Connecticut every year at Trinity College. It's been taking place for about 14 years now. This year, I had the privilege of performing at this festival back in April. And this is a place where hip-hop artists from all over, rappers, breakdancers, graffiti artists, and scholars come and convene and perform and do ciphers and really share in the global phenomena that hip-hop is today.
Yep. Okay. So we've described Rasa, aesthetic theory. We've described a little bit about hip-hop, and now we'd like to put them together. The question we're asking is, what is it about this aesthetic of challenge that resonates so strongly across cultures? We're going to use Rasa theory to assist us in naming the ingredients for this potent recipe. So you'll remember that Rasa arises in the spectator of a drama through the combination of excitants, indicators, and transitory emotional states. I'll just give you one example from the literature. If you're watching a love story, you would need some contextual factors to excite that mood. So it might be the presence of a beautiful other person. It might be a full moon or a lovely setting like a garden. Those would be the kind of contextual excitants that might awaken love. And then in a drama, you would see indicators. The actors, or that maybe the poem would evoke physical signs that one is feeling these things. So the lovers might get ready and dress up and put on makeup for one another, or they might blush or cast sidelong glances at one another, that kind of thing. And then there might be a variety of emotions in the drama, in the narrative, that heighten the overall mood of love. For example, there might be anger, a lover's quarrel, that contributes to the overall rasa of love. So in looking at the rasa of challenge, let's take a look at each of these factors.
Cool. So we're going to take a look at the excitants or the contextual markers of this rasa of challenge and how they show up in hip-hop performance. So some of the most prevalent excitants seen in hip-hop performance include poverty, police brutality, drugs, and gun violence. And excitants such as poverty and police brutality really show up in a great example in this group named DAM, D-A-M, and this is an Israeli-Palestinian group that was formed in 1999 by a rapper named Tamir Nafar. And he decided to start this group because he witnessed Tupac Shakur's music, and he saw the music video and saw the police brutality and the poverty depicted in the music video and thought to himself, wow, that's what's going on here in Israel, Palestine, present day. And so these stills are taken from a video by this group, and the song is called Born Here. And the group is aiming to shed light on the conditions of their neighborhood in Lod. So this is a Palestinian group that has Israeli citizenship. So they live in the city of Lod, and where they experience a lot of poverty and oppression, which is evident in the visual cues, such as a police station that replaced a school, other demolished buildings, and a lack of utilities, such as water and electricity. And so the video actually begins with this scene of an armed Israeli patrol approaching and harassing the Palestinian group as they begin to belt out their rap lyrics and performance. And so in the first verse, rapper Mahmoud Greri introduces listeners to the town of Lod, where law enforcement officers label Palestinians as criminal just for living there. The second verse is rapped by Tamir himself, where he talks about how many homes are destroyed in Lod, and the video eventually cuts to scenes of the rap group performing amid the rubble and the dust of their homeland. So we move on to the indicators. And the indicators for the rasa of challenge in hip-hop really show up in things that are shameless gestures. So we see this in acts of shouting and crowds raising their fists, dancing and wearing divergent styles of clothing to give off this confidence and this strength in community. And so we have here still taken from Kendrick Lamar's performance of his song King Kunta. Kendrick Lamar is from Compton, California. He's an American rapper. And if you follow most of his music, he raps about the hardships of living and growing up in Compton. And so in the video, there are various scenes where there are these shameless gestures. He's claiming to be king. He's claiming to be royal. He's sitting on a throne surrounded by men of all different generations, showing that community strength and defying the stereotypes that are placed on him as a black man in America. And then lastly, the third major ingredient for this Rasa of challenge, the complementary emotional states, which are a variety of sentiments that add depth and nuance to this mood. And so for this Rasa of challenge, these might show up as anger, anxiety, fear, numbness, hope, motivation, innovation, pride, survival, and solidarity. But what I really want to talk about is the bravado that is really pervasive in this hip-hop aesthetic. And so this is demonstrated, like I said before, in fashion, but it's also demonstrated in different words. And so this group here is Crudas Cubensi, and they're a Cuban hip-hop duo, and this is from their performance, Mi Cuerpo es Mío, My Body is Mine. And so they're reclaiming their bodies for themselves and showing this great confidence and bravado in solidarity with marginalized groups of women of Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean descent. And so the artists reclaim their bodies as well as their voices as queer women. And so in the repeated lines in this song, translated in English, you hear, "Keep your rosaries out of my ovaries," where the duo is challenging the religious authority with the claim that women own their bodies and not the Catholic Church.
So we've seen that these three factors are things that can be seen across cultural contexts. The excitants or contextual factors resonate in multiple places. The physical indicators that one is embodying this mood of challenge are similar across contexts, and there's a whole range of complementary emotions that resonate there. And this Rasa is something that bridges contexts. So this is going to be a little bit different than the classical Indian theory. In the Natya Shastra, the Rasa of fury, or that arises out of anger, is depicted in very class-based ways. It tends to be show up in characters that are low caste or demonic, and it's a very destructive Rasa. And so noble people don't tend to depict the Rasa of fury. Maybe a hero would depict courage instead, right? It's a heroic Rasa, but anger is really a low class type of thing to do. What we see here is that the Natya Shastra, the classical theory, is written from a dominant stratum of society. So what we're asking here when we look at challenge is to listen from the margins and understand that what's happening here is life-giving. It challenges the status quo in a way that demands the humanity of people at those margins. And what we want to claim is that we can savor this Rasa of challenge also in the gospel. So when we read in Scripture and remember the Exodus people leaving slavery, we can taste something of this challenge. When we think about Jesus and see how he gathers around himself a group of people to construct a different set of values than the Roman Empire, this kind of Rasa shows up, and we think that it serves as a kind of template so we can recognize it other places as well. So today, many people revere the martyrs of Latin America who were and are in solidarity with the Latin American-based communities. And now, again, with everybody having a cell phone and videos proliferating, the excitants And indicators and transitory emotional states are right in front of us all the time if we're paying attention. And so if ministers of the gospel are attuned to them, challenge will arise.
So we have a wonderful quote here from Brittany Gray, who is a Ferguson activist and also a seminary student. And she says, while I agree that there is a moral authority that comes from the church, this movement was not started by the church. This is really a movement of the streets. It's a hip-hop movement. And so as much as I am made and informed by the church, I am just as much made and informed by hip-hop as a culture. I live and breathe it, and so yes, I would have been engaged regardless because I grew up listening to Tupac and Biggie, to Common, to Dead Prez, to Eric B. and Rakim. I grew up on all of it which told me that the system was messed up, and I cannot listen to those lyrics, see those lyrics, internalize those lyrics, and not have a response. And so what she's really describing here is that the driver of this movement, of Black Lives Matter and many other movements, is not from the pews, but rather from the music and the aesthetics she grew up on. So while the church participates in the movement, it must recognize that the essence and the very nature of the movement was birthed from the aesthetic proclamation of hip-hop several decades ago. The artists she names are most prominent late 80s, early 90s. And what this implies is that clergy are invited to listen and to be attuned to the proclamation and the witness of the aesthetic itself.
So this conference challenged us to think about what mission might look like in the context of the Rasa of challenge. And the first thing that we would say is that it requires that clergy roles, missionary roles, shift out of the center of activity. Leah Gunning Francis describes in her book, Ferguson and Faith, that there was a moment during the protest on September 29th, 2014 in Ferguson, when the police and the protesters were squaring off and tensions were very heightened and it looked like violence was about to break out. And the clergy who were there decided to put their bodies in the way. They went between the two lines, knelt down in the street, and began to pray. And the mood changed. The police didn't really know what to do with this, and the tension kind of dissipated. This is a different kind of protester, right? The tension dissipated, and nobody got arrested that night. And after the prayer, one of the clergy members asked the activist leader, "What do you want us to do now?" And they said, "Thank you very much. We've got this now." And the clergy went and stood on the sidewalk again. They took their place at the sidelines. So ancillary roles. In the Ferguson protest, you see the clergy putting their bodies on the line. They would go to jail when the protesters were arrested. They would offer various kinds of assistance. For example, they would bring their cell phones in so that the people who had been arrested could stay connected in their grassroots organization. They would call judges and lawyers to work for their release. And they would also be a conduit of information so that what the media was portraying wasn't the only information that people would have about the protest. So the first thing is these ancillary leadership roles in a movement like this. The second has to do with why the expressions of this kind of mission are going to be countercultural. And it's because of the perception of impurity that adheres to movements like this. Rima Vesely-Flad writes about this quite a bit in her book on the movement. She observed that Jesus touched the untouchable. He associated with people on the margins, and he himself died a shameful and polluted death. And she sees a strong resonance with the racialized pollution boundaries that permeate American culture today. drawing an interfaith link, the interfaith leader Ibu Patel writes in a recent book about how growing up in Chicago, he was very attracted to hip hop, which his parents discouraged him from listening to because it was an impure musical form. So this theme of impurity shows up all the time in these contexts. And when clergy associate their vestments and rituals with black and brown bodies, with hip-hop artists, with people of diverse faiths and no faith at all, Rima Vesely-Flad tells us, there's a symbolic reversal. The protesters, black and brown, confrontational, represent moral purity.
And lastly, there's solidarity and repentance. Clergy in Ferguson have described this instinctual shift to recognize the worth and authority of lay protesters as repentance. Sean Jones, an assistant pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church Complex in St. Louis, recalls, and I quote, "We apologize for not getting it. We apologize for the inconsistent presence of the black church in the community before this moment," end quote. So by listening to people fed up with injustice and by accepting protesters as they are, Christian leaders and clergy are inspired, drawn in, and converted anew to the gospel task. More than just a notional acceptance, their affects and emotions change when they have truly tasted the rasa of challenge. They start to experience the affective states appropriate to this mode of engagement. And because they've entered into the embodied practices, music, and stories of protest, their response to others is not with disgust, but it's one that is out of love and solidarity that permeates their ministry.
When I was researching Tastes of the Divine, I ran into a kind of paradox in Indian Christian spirituality that had to do with caste, actually. So the Dalit Christians that I met when I was researching the book really strongly resisted classical art forms as sort of helpful for them because they stemmed from upper caste, but also because there was the perception that the art forms themselves were pacifying, that they sort of blunted some of the anger that was actually really, really important to their spirituality. And so they preferred folk styles of art for their worship and for their protests. And so I kept encountering this conversation about, well, if you're only angry all the time, what's going to sustain you? Don't you need some meditation? But no, is that actually an oppressive form of spirituality, and so forth? What we're seeing here and what we want to claim is that peace might be a complementary emotional state to the rasa of challenge. When the clergy knelt down and prayed, they brought a moment of silence, but it wasn't a moment of silencing. It was a way of giving voice to the angst and suffering of the protesters. And it probably saved some lives, actually. Nobody got shot, nobody went to jail. Those who had been shouting for recognition of their humanity stood alongside people who heard their cries. So it wasn't a peace that was pacifying. It was a taste of the inbreaking reign of God. And so peace is a complementary emotional state to the rasa of challenge. Its surprise appearances are placeholders for the eschaton, the desired future state of affairs in which all are accepted, all are recognized as created in the divine image, in which everyone can walk down the street or drive a car without being molested, in which each person has a chance at a future. These tastes of peace, which are part of a ministry of presence, hold a place for hope. And so ministry and mission still participate in the eschaton and anticipate it. Until God's will is done on earth as in heaven, ministry will have the flavor of challenge.
So I will end on a peaceful note of more hip hop. So there's a reason why we do what we do, move how we move, Basis for the way that we groove, speaking in tunes, culture birth from rhythm and blues, hip-hop the news, so come and take a walk in our shoes. We are canvases lifted up by justice's easel, rewriting the narrative, and this is only a preview. So if you want to make a difference in society's sequel, swallow your pride, let sacred be redefined by the people. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I congratulate Dr. Voss-Roberts and Reverend Day on such a stimulating and thought-provoking lecture and such an imaginative presentation. Who would have thought the weaving together of ancient Hindu dramatic forms and categories of thought with hip-hop is innovative, to say the least, and yet turns out to be so enriching. I will confess straight away that I have no background in hip-hop, nor much in art, so I learned a great deal from the presentation. However, when it comes to Sanskrit wisdom and Hindu aesthetics, I was able to connect a bit more. For 4 years in the 1990s, my husband, Sebastian Kim, who's over there, also professor at Fuller, and I lived and taught at Union Biblical Seminary in Pune in India. And afterwards, I did my PhD research on Indian Christian theologies of the Holy Spirit, while continuing to work with Indian colleagues and living in the multicultural and multi-religious context of Birmingham in England. As we heard, the Hindu concept of rasa refers to an aesthetic or mood which resonates with common human experience. It excites, signifies, and arouses us. 8 such aesthetics were identified 2 millennia ago. Roberts and Reverend Day suggests that this taxonomy could be further supplemented with the aesthetic of challenge, which questions, disputes, and confronts injustices. We saw the evidence that there is a common human aesthetic of challenge in hip-hop. Justice-oriented artists are generating the art, such as rapping, breakdancing, drama, graffiti that we heard about, that is at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement. But hip-hop, it is argued, transcends languages and cultural differences. And in the paper, they said more about how it had been appropriated in Palestine and in other parts of the world. The presenters suggest that this rasa of challenge, as shown in hip-hop, is also the response of clergy, activists, and others who, like Jesus, have sided with the victims, the oppressed, and the marginalized. It confronts a different aesthetic, which, instead of identifying, rejects or distances itself from black bodies and from the poor. Such an opposite aesthetic leads people to abuse, imprison, or even kill. I'd like to respond to this rich presentation in 2 main ways. First, by considering the rasa of challenge in its Indian context, and second, by examining the theological method used for this lecture. So first, India. I agree wholeheartedly with the importance of an aesthetic of challenge to injustice, of course. And in India, as we've heard, a glaring injustice is the treatment of Dalits, also known as scheduled castes and formerly untouchables. Dalits have for centuries been regarded by the higher castes as dirty and polluting. Despite caste discrimination being illegal in contemporary India, such attitudes linger long, and Dalits continue to be treated in inhuman ways. However, the concept of rasas comes from the Brahminic traditions that have excluded Dalit communities and maintained caste segregation. Rasas are found in elite texts, as the paper says, emphasizing art in the service of duty, order, and composure. No wonder that today's presenters admit that the aesthetic of challenge is foreign to Rasa theory as yet. The divide between elite Hinduism and Dalit experience has posed a challenge for missionaries, whether foreign or Indian, from Francis Xavier and Robert de Nobili onward. Xavier had worked with the poor, but de Nobili began with the Brahmins. However, de Nobili's expectation that the conversion of the elite would reach the whole of Indian society turned out to be misplaced. Even today, there are high caste churches that exclude Dalits altogether. For similar reasons, recently Indian theologians have been castigated by Dalit theologians for developing Indian Christian theology by affirming the Sanskrit texts and Brahminic thought that has enslaved them for so long, instead of practicing the rasa of challenge and empowering the poor. The divide between caste Hindus and the downtrodden Dalit community is so great that it is hard to imagine that challenge will ever be incorporated into the typology of rasas. Yet, as I reflected on this, Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian independence leader, although a caste Hindu well-versed in Sanskrit texts, is known around the world for the challenge he gave to the British Empire. Moreover, his rasa of peace inspired Martin Luther King, among others, in their non-violent methods. Gandhi was an extraordinary character who broke caste taboos by embracing Dalits and eating with them. He renamed the untouchables as the Harijan, or children of God. However, in spite of the fact that he reached out to them, Dalits are highly critical of Gandhi. Ultimately, his rasa of challenge was not enough for him to renounce the caste system. In fact, he's on record as supporting it as a social structure. Nor did he support the separate electorate that Dalits themselves requested to overcome intouchability. While there were political calculations involved, it could also be argued that it was his elite religious background that inclined Gandhi to give greater weight to gestures than to Dalit wishes for structural change. In every religious text, every belief system has a social location. Can we separate systems of thought from the ways they have been applied historically? Could using artistic forms sometimes be a way of avoiding social realities? Secondly, and lastly, I would like to draw attention to the method employed in this lecture. We've just witnessed, I believe, a product of the comparative religion approach, which Dr. Voss-Roberts explains lucidly in the introduction to her recent edited work, Comparing Faithfully, 2016. Dr. Roberts is a pioneer of the emerging discipline of comparative theology, by which she means to transform the contemporary practice of theology. In the book, she argues that in a religiously plural world, it's natural for us to make comparisons between texts, between beliefs and practices of different religions. Therefore, theological education should help students negotiate this reality in a way that is faithful to their own tradition, while not misrepresenting the others with which they engage. Her approach is to compare particular features of different faiths rather than whole religions, and to be suggestive rather than categorical, and I think we've seen that clearly tonight. Related to this, some of my own work has used comparative methods to investigate Christian theologies from India and Korea in a way that tries to avoid privileging my Western perspective. It occurs to me that studying Asian Christian theologies is also an indirect dialogue with other faiths, because religious plurality is the context in many parts of Asia. Perhaps we should start our interreligious theology by hearing from our Christian sisters and brothers who have lived alongside other faiths, in many cases, for centuries. Reflecting on the comparative method and its effectiveness will stimulate us to consider whether we can do constructive Christian theology by comparison with aspects of other faiths, and how we might better equip students theologically for the multi-religious reality in which we do mission. There's a lot to discuss, and once again, I want to thank our speakers for sharing with us this imaginative and stimulating lecture this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your wonderful presentation. As an earlier piece, this was an example itself of a work of art. You put these things together in a wonderful way. Thank you very much, and thank you for your response, Dr. Kim. I think I would like to know, first of all, from the side of, from the point of view of hip-hop and its development, would you say that there was something about hip-hop itself that developed this notion of challenge, or what are the sources of this? Tell us, what is your feeling of that?
Sure. Yes, I think that there is something about hip-hop that brings up this notion of challenge in and of itself, not necessarily being connected to the movements, but because hip-hop in itself has this challenge in it, and given its historical context with the marginalized and the oppressed, it then follows that the movements would be connected to that.
Which leads me to wonder whether there isn't some sort of similar movement among the Dalit to develop these kind of similar challenges. Has there been a challenge, a rasa of challenge developing among Dalit art forms?
So there's a theologian named James Theophilus Apavu who taught at the Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary, and he was a songwriter, a hymn writer, and he rails against the Indian classical music as being pacifying, almost like a drug or alcohol that Dalits should not imbibe. And so he composes songs in folk genres, and they're protest songs. So that would be a kind of parallel, except for that he's doing that specifically in the service of music for Christians or music for church in a seminary context. And that's not what we've been looking at. We've been looking at a sort of organic thing that's happening in the streets and communicating globally without too much concern for what the churches are going to do with it. And in fact, we made the choice not to make the argument that churches start bringing hip hop into the sanctuary because that might be a kind of way of co-opting the art form. What's really demanded is some deep listening and joining people where they are in the streets with the movement there.
And is this what you feel that the Rasa of Challenge does? Because one of the questioners wanted to know what is it that the Rasa of Challenge adds that the Rasa of Fury didn't do?
You want to? Oh. So I did try to mobilize the Rasa of Fury in this direction in Taste of the Divine. It's the whole third section of the book, and So, you know, anger was the closest thing I could see to what was happening there. But I feel like I had to be kind of creative with that, and nobody was exactly naming it that way. I could find a thread where people talked about anger as a passion for justice. I think it's defensible. You know, I still stand by what I wrote in the book, but in the way that solidarity with these movements became so much a part of the context at the Divinity School. There's a Black Lives Matter banner in the back of the chapel, and for a few years, the worship during Black History Month was really, really raw, it felt different than the sort of. It was already a prophetic place, and we'd all experienced prophetic ministry before, but there was something about it that was not willing to put a Band-Aid or look away, but just be really challenged. And so there was a kind of intensification there, which is, Rasa is an intensification of something ordinary that art affects for us. So when we, I think we may have even started by saying, well, you know, I thought, well, we could talk more about anger, but talk about hip hop. And then we realized it was something else. There was something else going on, and we needed a different name for it.
And that's where the Rasa challenge came in. Kristen?
If I could just say a bit more about I mean, there is a big Dalit solidarity movement in India, and indigenous forms are used, but of course India is a big place, and Dalits are not one community. There are many different communities, so many different art forms could be employed. They're about 20% of the population of India, so and it would be very regional, and there are many different languages and so on as well. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of hip hop in India now, but it's a while it's a while since we lived there. But sure. Yeah, I'm sure you would find there's similar connections.
And one thing that I would add to that is it's many regions, but Dalits are also many religions. Yes. And so there is a sort of shared... The movement for Dalit rights is an interreligious movement, and so the problems are shared across contexts, and you know sometimes the art forms as well. But it doesn't matter so much which religion you're coming from when you're working for these justice issues.
But the dichotomy that you describe between the kind of high kind of cultured, you know, what we used to talk about one culture, or you know, civilization, or something or other, and you kind of, and a cultured person was somebody who had studied the arts and music and so on, and also and in many, I mean, you can think of Confucianism as well, developed self-control and so on. So the elite, usually male, who aspires to these things feels that they're in control of all their emotions, and generally these cultured people are the despisers of the common religion, and it is a pattern. You can see it in English culture, you know, how class and religion go together. You can see it in many parts of the world, I think. But in India, it struck me as particularly marked, and it actually splits the missionary community, so that you have those who are working with the high caste, who are trying to enculturate with respect to Hindu tradition, and others who are working with the Dalit community. So the ones looking to effect change from the top, and expecting that change at the top will somehow trickle down. And others who, you know, want to mobilize from below and see that as the only way that things are going to change. And so Christians, you know, get caught up in these cultural dynamics.
I understand that you're applying the Rasa challenge and connecting with hip hop. But I'm just curious to know whether the Dalit communities in India, if they reject the whole notion, would they be impressed with your understanding of a Rasa challenge? Would this be something they're interested in even appropriating?
So I wrote a whole chapter on this because I was wondering the same thing. Like, oh dear, this is Sanskritic culture, and I encountered in my interviews and the people that I knew and hung out with when I was in India, that it didn't matter what strata of society they were from. Rasa is a cultural currency. It's part of the language, and so people know what the 9 rasas are, and they talk about feeling in terms of rasa, and so. That wasn't, I was a little hesitant about saying, would you even talk about this? And, oh, yes, when we're dancing, when we're drumming, there's so much rasa. And so I wouldn't say I got a representative sample, but in some of the writings by Dalit activist leaders, there's language of rasa there. And so that's a common cultural currency, but something particular is happening in the aesthetic literature that perhaps not everybody's clued into. So, but I think it's fair to talk about feeling in that way.
Interesting, yeah. Somebody wants to know, since the Rasa theory is basically a theory of emotions, how do you select the appropriate one as a response to social injustice and things? In other words, what's the sort of norms that you apply to assess which rasa it would be an appropriate emotional response?
Well, it arises from the body, and so it happens. And so in ordinary everyday life, you encounter various stimuli, and you react to them, right? If somebody cuts you off in traffic, you don't decide whether to be upset about that, right?
That's true. Good point.
But at the level of a creator of art, you would want to think really carefully about, what do I want my audience to perceive, right? Yeah. And am I putting the right ingredients in so that they will experience what I'm hoping to create. And there's a lot in Rasa theory actually about art that goes bad. There are obstacles to feeling rasa. Like, for example, one of the obstacles to a love story is if there's something disgusting, right? It just kills the whole mood. And so as an artist, you're going to make good decisions about what fosters this rasa that I'm hoping to create, and what do I want to leave out because it would get in the way. And I imagine, Demi, as an artist, you make decisions, right? This is going to work. This isn't going to work.
Yes, and a part of that I was hoping to embody in the opening and closing of our presentation, and
you did very well.
Very discerning of what would be a best representation of the rasa of challenge, as opposed to selecting maybe a different piece to open us with.
It seems to me what you both have contributed to the day's conversation is that we've heard earlier that art doesn't bother about cultural and religious boundaries. Artists' creativity will cross those boundaries. That's what it's about, But what you're proposing is that it does something more. The carriers of hip hop has this ability then not simply to cross these boundaries, but actually to oppose, to challenge, to set up against something that is to be resisted. And not simply to be enjoyed, but it's to excite this kind of resistance. I find that a really interesting and very important contribution to our. Is there a sense in which, because of your own location religiously, that you think that maybe challenge is a unique contribution that the gospel makes to the interreligious situation? Or is it something that rises sort of intrinsically in hip-hop? This is a question.
I mean, I personally think it's definitely connected to the gospel message and the example that we see from Jesus in the way that he challenged some of the norms of religious piety in his day. you know, and started a conversation among people, you know, that then we get Christianity out of that, right? But, I mean, in the way in which he challenged, right, ultimately led to Jesus being on the cross.
Right.
And so, I mean, there's something at stake for
Good,
artists who engage in challenging. And that's not to say that, like, hip-hop itself, hip-hop artists are all doing that, right? Because there are hip-hop artists creating art that is not challenging, right? But there is a vein of hip-hop that goes back to the 70s that is that challenge embodiment.
You think its origin originally was the black church in some way? I mean, I know this is happening outside the church and all. I mean, at that point, really. But isn't there a sense in which that, or the black spirituals and...
I mean, it's all in there, right?
Yeah,
so, I mean, we can infer that the early hip-hop artists were informed by black church theology, right, and doctrine. So, I mean, it's all kind of tied in there. Rhythm and blues is tied in there. Blues is tied in there. Country is tied in there, right? And it all culminates into what we get with hip-hop.
Right.
And I would add that, you know, like the black church isn't always super supportive of hip hop,
right? That's a good point too.
You know, the blues, or you know, and so that important connection, I think, is there, and Christians have that. We have Jesus, who is on the side of the marginalized, and himself was utterly marginalized, and at the same time, Christianity and churches have become institutions and have become the status quo. And so I don't want to make any great grand claims about mainline denominations, but you know, I think it makes sense that that this art form and this challenge right now, today, in the United States, is happening outside of the comfort of those institutions.
That's true. And that's a very important point. And the church does tend to kill its children in a certain sense, or at least exclude its children. I came across recently the fact that Martin Luther King in the 50s was very opposed to black music and the emerging kind of music that would eventually lead to this. Now, I think later maybe he changed because he saw the role that it played in the civil rights movement. But initially, there was that resistance, and I think that's true of the institutional church in general. So.
And maybe even in the institutional civil rights movement. And so it's interesting as part of our research. So we were in North Carolina, and the William Barber's Moral Mondays movement is based there. And we talked to a couple of music writers, right? They who are responsible for the movement music, and they described how they'd be writing this movement music on the fly, and then at the next protest they would sing. They would sort of teach a call and response type of thing, and it would be, you know, some of the protest genres and lots of genres actually that they were using, which is really interesting. And I see a kind of analogy with, you know, churches thinking, okay, how do we tap into the music that will, you know, move people? And within the movements, there's this sort of not your mama's civil rights movement, right? And so there are different methods and different communities who employ the arts in you know, the basic impulse is the same. Like, arts are important here, but the intentionality behind it is sort of reversed.
Yeah, and I think, circling back, a big part of that is respectability politics, which the black churches continuously ascribe to respectability politics. And like we were saying before, art doesn't care about those lines.
It doesn't care about that, Well, thank you very much. This happens every time. At the very end, when we run out of time, the whole bunch of questions come in. You know, we're sitting here waiting.
We'll be here all day tomorrow.
And so tomorrow we'll address some of those. And thank you again, all three of you, and give them appreciation. See you all tomorrow, 9 o'clock.
We go to Africa.
Tomorrow we go to Africa. All over the place. Okay, get ready, get your passports, and join us.